In the fertile, sun-drenched fields of Georgia in 1845, the Westfield Plantation stood as a symbol of wealth and dominance. Its grand, columned mansion rose high above the sprawling estate, casting long, imposing shadows over the lush crops that flourished beneath the southern Sunday. To the world, it was a place of beauty, of fortune, and of power. The land itself spoke of affluence, and the enslaved workers, in their toiling labor, upheld the illusion of prosperity. But beneath the surface of this well-manicured life lay a dark, twisted secret that few outside the estate would ever know. Mrs. Margaret Westfield, the lady of the plantation, was not just a woman of society. She was a woman consumed by ambition, her intelligence and obsession with scientific theory, giving her a dangerous kind of power over the lives of the people who lived under her control. Widow to a late, wealthy plantation owner, Margaret had inherited his land and his legacy. But it wasn't enough for her. No, she sought something more, something even more sinister. In her mind, the enslaved people were not just laborers, they were subjects for her experiments. Margaret had long been fascinated with the idea of improvement, how the human body, mind, and spirit could be altered, enhanced, or even perfected. And in her cold, calculated mind, the people she enslaved were merely tools for her twisted scientific pursuits. She would test her theories on them, subjecting them to physical and mental trials, all while masking her cruelty with the veneer of a lady's grace. The plantation that had once been a symbol of Southern nobility would soon be known for something far darker, a place where the bodies and minds of the enslaved were treated as nothing more than experiments, and where one woman's obsession would leave a legacy of horror that would haunt the land for generations. But as Margaret's experiments grew more grotesque, the enslaved began to see the truth. Among them was Thomas, a man who had long been disillusioned with the world of the plantation, but who, like so many others, had been too fearful to act. As the horrors of Margaret's experimentation began to unfold, Thomas knew that the time had come to resist, to fight for their freedom and for justice. But it would not be easy. The road ahead was fraught with danger, and no one could predict how far Margaret would go to maintain control. Before we step into this tale of terror and defiance, I want to know where you're watching from. What time is it in your world? Can you feel the weight of what is about to unfold, the cruelty of one woman's obsession, and the struggle of those who will not stand for it? Drop a comment below, and if stories of rebellion and the fight for freedom resonate with you, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in the shadows of history for too long. Margaret Westfield stood in front of her vanity, the flickering candlelight casting a soft glow over her porcelain skin. The reflection in the mirror showed a woman of perfect composure, her dark hair neatly pulled back into a stylish knot, her dress impeccable. She was the epitome of grace and refinement, a lady of means in the South, and she wore her status as a badge of honor. To the world, Margaret was the ideal plantation mistress, polite, educated, and unassumingly powerful. She hosted extravagant dinner parties, attended the most prestigious social events, and was regarded as an aristocrat among aristocrats. But behind the facade of Southern charm, there lay a darkness few would ever suspect. Margaret's husband, John Westfield, had passed away a year earlier, leaving her the plantation's sole owner. He had been a man of wealth and influence, his fortune built on the backs of the enslaved people who worked the land. Margaret, a woman of exceptional intellect and curiosity, had never quite shared his views on slavery. While John had viewed the enslaved as mere property, a necessary part of the economic engine that drove their wealth, Margaret saw them as something more, subjects for her scientific exploration. She had always been fascinated by the work of prominent scientists, particularly those who dabbled in the strange and controversial world of human experimentation. Her husband's wealth, combined with her own intelligence and ruthless ambition, gave her access to books, journals, and materials that most would never have imagined possible. It was this intellectual curiosity, paired with her desire for control, that pushed Margaret to see the enslaved people on her estate not as human beings, but as bodies to be studied and manipulated. Her interest in human improvement was not born of compassion, but of a twisted desire to see if she could mold and perfect those she controlled. Margaret believed that, through experimentation, she could alter the physical and mental attributes of the enslaved. She could make them stronger, more docile, more productive. She could improve their lives. Or so she believed. And in doing so, she would elevate herself above the moral limitations of the world around her. At first, her experiments were small, measuring the endurance of her workers, testing their reaction to physical pain, manipulating their diets to see how it affected their labor output. But soon, her curiosity deepened. She began isolating specific individuals, conducting what she called treatments. The treatments were designed to test her theories on mental and physical transformation. She would take a select group of slaves, force them into grueling tasks, starve them, subject them to extreme conditions, and study their reactions. Her objective? To improve them, to shape them into something she believed was a more perfected version of what they had been. But the experiments were not without consequences. The slaves who underwent Margaret's trials began to show signs of severe stress, physical deformities, mental breakdowns, and even death. But Margaret was unfazed. Her studies, in her mind, were for the greater good, for the advancement of mankind. And if some of her subjects had to suffer for her work, then so be it. Margaret kept her experiments a secret from her social circles. To the world, she was a gentle and sophisticated lady. She spoke of charity and improvement in public. She played the role of the gracious hostess, always careful to avoid suspicion. But behind closed doors, in the stark, sterile rooms of her mansion, the true nature of her research unfolded. As for the slaves, they had begun to whisper among themselves. Some of them had begun to notice the strange occurrences, how some of their fellow workers disappeared for days at a time, never to return. Others had seen the marks on the bodies of those who had been subjected to Margaret's experiments, scars and bruises that told a grim story. But they were terrified to speak out, afraid of the retribution that would come if they did. One man, Thomas, who had been on the plantation for years, knew something was wrong. He had always been observant, always aware of the subtle ways in which the colonel's power was exercised. But this was different. Margaret's experiments were far more sinister than any punishment or cruel treatment he had seen before. He had witnessed firsthand the toll it was taking on the slaves, how they were being broken, slowly and painfully, for her twisted version of progress. As the days passed, Thomas began to feel a growing sense of dread. He had to act, but how? The slaves were isolated, divided by fear and uncertainty. There was no one to turn to. Yet, in the quietest of moments, Thomas felt a fire of resistance kindling inside him. He knew that the time was coming when the people would have to rise not just for freedom, but for their very humanity. The oppressive heat of Georgia in the summer months was stifling. The air was thick with humidity, and the slaves working the fields felt its weight in every drop of sweat that dripped from their brow. But despite the grueling labor under the unforgiving sun, there was something else hanging in the air, an unspoken fear that had begun to fester among the enslaved workers. Whispers of strange happenings on the plantation had started to spread, rumors that none dared speak of aloud for fear of punishment, or worse, disappearance. It was in the stillness of the night that Margaret's experiments began to escalate. Her studies were no longer confined to subtle tests of endurance or measuring physical reactions. She had moved into darker territory, using her position as plantation mistress to isolate certain individuals, subjecting them to treatments that none could have imagined. The first few volunteers, as Margaret called them, were chosen not for their willingness, but for their obedience. They were those who had been the most compliant, the least likely to resist. Margaret believed that she could alter their very nature, that she could perfect them. It was not the slaves' bodies she wanted to perfect, no. To her, they were nothing more than vessels for her twisted vision. She saw their humanity not as a virtue but as a flaw to be overcome. They were to be molded like clay, refined to fit into her vision of an ideal workforce, stronger, more docile, more productive. The methods she used were vile. One of the first to be subjected to her experiments was a young woman named Rebecca, known for her strength and stamina in the fields. Margaret had long watched her, admiring her endurance, and in her mind, she had decided that Rebecca's body was the perfect subject for her new treatment. Margaret ordered Rebecca to be brought into the mansion, where she would be confined to one of the many sterile rooms that had been set up for scientific purposes. The room was cold, stark, with metal tables and vials of strange substances that Margaret had acquired from various doctors and chemists, all of them convinced by her brilliant mind and womanly charm. For days, Rebecca was subjected to injections that caused her muscles to seize, to tremble uncontrollably. Margaret watched from behind her desk, taking notes in her meticulously organized journal as Rebecca cried out in pain. The pain, however, was part of the process, Margaret's process. She was convinced that the human body could be pushed beyond its limits, reshaped, perfected. As Rebecca's strength began to dwindle, her body growing weaker under the strain, Margaret saw it as nothing more than data. The woman was no longer a person to her. She was an experiment, a failure, but a valuable one nonetheless. By the time Margaret was finished with Rebecca, the young woman's body was nearly unrecognizable. Her skin was pale and bruised, her eyes hollow from the pain, but to Margaret, it was nothing but a stepping stone to the next stage of her work. The experiment had not been successful, but that failure only spurred Margaret to push further. She would not give up so easily. In her mind, there was always a way to perfect the process. She had to refine it. She had to make it work. The whispers among the slaves grew louder, but no one dared to confront Margaret directly. They were too fearful of the consequences. They had seen what happened to those who defied her. A slave who spoke out against her experiments would vanish, their fate left unknown. Some would be sent to the deepest parts of the estate, forced to work in the most hazardous conditions, never to be seen again. Others simply disappeared, their bodies found later, discarded as though they had never mattered. Thomas, who had long observed Margaret from a distance, grew more and more unsettled by what he saw. He had noticed Rebecca's absence after the first experiment, and he had witnessed the slow, agonizing return of another, a man named Elijah, who had been subjected to one of Margaret's treatments. The man had once been strong, resilient in his work, but now he could barely walk, his legs weak and trembling under the strain. He had been given something, a concoction, Margaret had told him, that would improve his reflexes, make him faster, stronger. The reality had been far worse. Elijah was broken, his body ruined by the treatment. His mind was clouded, and his spirit shattered. It was in the quiet moments, after the workday ended and the slaves gathered in the quarters to rest, that Thomas began to see the extent of the horror Margaret had unleashed. He was a man who had lived through the cruelties of slavery for years, but nothing had prepared him for this. This was not just about hard labor. This was about erasing the very essence of a person, transforming them into something less than human. And as much as Thomas wanted to ignore it, to believe that this was just another form of cruelty in a life built on oppression, he knew deep down that what Margaret was doing was far worse than anything he had ever imagined. One evening, after the colonel had retired to his study, Thomas sought out Elijah. The man was in a small room at the back of the quarters, his body trembling as he sat on the cot, staring blankly at the wall. Thomas approached him quietly, his heart heavy with concern. "Elijah," Thomas said gently, kneeling beside the bed. "What happened to you?" Elijah's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment, there was a glimmer of recognition, but it quickly faded, and he turned his gaze back to the wall. It's nothing," he muttered. "I'm fine. I just need rest." Thomas could see the hollow look in his eyes, the emptiness that had taken root in the man's soul. He could see what the treatment had done to him, not just physically, but mentally. Elijah had been broken, not by the work he had done, but by Margaret's cruel experiments. He had been used, twisted, and discarded. Thomas clenched his fists in anger, but he knew that anger would not change anything. Not yet. He had to do something. He couldn't let Margaret's experiments continue unchecked. He could no longer stand by and watch as she destroyed the lives of those around him. The realization hit him like a weight in his chest. He had to act. He had to stop her before she destroyed more lives, before she experimented on any more of his brothers and sisters. But the question was, how? How could he bring down a woman who held so much power over them? How could he confront the evil that had taken root in the heart of the plantation? In the days that followed, Thomas began to quietly organize. He spoke to the others in hushed tones, passing along the news that they could no longer stay silent. They could no longer allow themselves to be treated like cattle. They had to fight back. It wasn't just about escaping, it was about confronting the nightmare that had been unleashed on them. And as Thomas spoke to the men and women on the plantation, he realized one thing. They were ready. Margaret's cruelty would not go unchallenged. The rebellion was coming. The oppressive heat of summer seemed to hang in the air longer than usual at Westfield Plantation, as if the land itself was suffocating under the weight of Margaret Westfield's experiments. The mansion, once a symbol of grandeur and Southern aristocracy, now stood as a looming reminder of the horrors that took place behind its closed doors. The enslaved workers, who had once moved with an eerie routine under the watchful eye of the colonel, now found themselves ensnared in a much darker web, the web of Mrs. Margaret Westfield's twisted obsession with human experimentation. Margaret's experiments had started small, almost innocuous, in the eyes of the public. Testing endurance, monitoring the physical strength of her slaves. But as the days passed, her methods grew more grotesque, her thirst for scientific progress turning into an uncontrollable need for domination. The slaves who were once subjected to simple, physical tests now found themselves prisoners in her laboratory, her sterile rooms a far cry from the free air they had once breathed. Each morning, Margaret chose a new subject, often without any warning, isolating them from the others and placing them in the treatment room where they would endure hours of torment. For her, these tests were the culmination of her intellectual pursuits, the belief that she could elevate the human form, control the body and mind, and perfect them in ways no one had ever imagined. But for the enslaved, each test was a death sentence, a fate far worse than the back-breaking labor they had been accustomed to. Rebecca, the young woman Margaret had experimented on first, had been but a harbinger of things to come. She had disappeared from the plantation after the first round of experiments, her body broken and her mind shattered by the torment she had endured. Thomas had seen it all. He had watched Rebecca's fragile frame, once strong and vibrant, crumble under the weight of Margaret's cruel treatment. But it was Elijah's turn now. Elijah had been one of the more stoic and proud men on the plantation. A natural leader among the enslaved, he had always commanded respect. But now, the spark in his eyes had dimmed. His body, once capable of carrying heavy loads and enduring long days in the field, was a shadow of itself. Margaret had taken him for her next round of experiments this time. Her objective was not physical endurance, but something much darker. She wanted to see how far she could push the human body before it cracked, how much pain and suffering it could withstand before the mind snapped. She had already learned that physical torture could break a person down, but the next phase was far worse: mental and emotional devastation. She wanted to see how far she could take her subjects, how much they would endure before their will broke. Elijah had been subjected to a series of injections designed to manipulate his nervous system. Margaret, ever the scientist, had taken notes as she observed how Elijah's body began to react to the toxic concoctions she administered. His heart raced, his breathing became erratic, and his legs trembled under the strain. His mind, too, was being altered slowly, agonizingly by chemicals she believed could increase a person's strength and stamina. But it wasn't strength she was creating, it was madness. After several days of this treatment, Elijah became a shell of the man he had been. His mind, once sharp and steady, had begun to unravel. He had stopped speaking, stopped moving, only able to sit in the small, dark room Margaret had confined him to, his eyes vacant, staring at nothing. Thomas, who had been keeping a close watch on Elijah's condition, saw the change immediately. Elijah had always been a proud man, someone who could hold his head high even in the most difficult of circumstances. But now, he was a broken man, a victim of Margaret's cruel designs. Thomas could no longer stand by and do nothing. He had seen enough, and he could no longer ignore the suffering Margaret had brought upon them all. That night, after the colonel had retired to his study and the plantation had settled into an uneasy silence, Thomas gathered the small group of enslaved men and women who had begun to question Margaret's methods. They met in secret, in the corner of the slave quarters, their voices hushed by the fear of being overheard. "We can't let her continue this," Thomas said, his voice filled with a quiet but determined rage. "She's destroying us. We've seen what she's done to Elijah, to Rebecca, to others. We can't let it go on any longer." "But what can we do, Thomas?" one of the men asked, his voice trembling with fear. "She has all the power. The colonel does nothing to stop her. She has control over everything." Thomas glanced around the room, his eyes meeting those of the others. They were all scared. They had been for years. But there was something else in their eyes now, something that had been missing before. Resolve. They had been broken, but they were not beyond repair. "We fight back," Thomas said firmly. "We can't let her win. We've been oppressed for too long. She doesn't see us as human. She sees us as experiments, as objects to be used. But we are not her property. We are not her playthings. We are people, and we will fight for our freedom, for our dignity." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled in. They all knew the risks. They knew what would happen if they were caught. But they also knew that if they did nothing, they would continue to live in Margaret's nightmare. Her experiments would continue, and more of them would be destroyed. Over the next few days, the small group of rebels began to quietly spread the word. They gathered what little information they could about Margaret's next experiment, who would be her next victim, what method she would use, and how they could stop it before it went any further. Thomas had already begun to organize them quietly, carefully, so that when the time came, they would be ready. But as they prepared for the rebellion, Margaret, too, had begun to notice the growing discontent. She could feel the tension in the air, the subtle resistance brewing beneath the surface. She was not a woman to be underestimated, and she knew that the people she had used for her experiments were no longer docile. The cracks in her control were becoming more apparent, and she began to take measures to reinforce her authority. But it was too late. The slaves on the Westfield plantation had been pushed too far, and now they were ready to fight back. The tension that had been quietly building on the Westfield plantation finally reached a breaking point in the dead of night. The air, thick with humidity, seemed to pulse with anticipation as the slaves prepared to make their move. The whispers of revolt, once confined to the shadows of the quarters, had now solidified into a plan. Margaret's experiments had pushed them beyond the point of no return, and the time had come to strike back. Thomas, who had spent the last few days quietly organizing the rebels, stood in the center of the group. His heart raced, but his mind was calm. He had seen too much suffering, too many broken bodies and shattered lives, to back down now. The men and women gathered around him were ready. They had no choice but to be. They had lost too much already. Now, they were taking the first step toward reclaiming their lives. "You know what's at stake," Thomas whispered, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "If we fail, the colonel will come after us, and Margaret will make sure we never see another day of freedom. But if we succeed, we change everything. We end her experiments. We end this nightmare. And we finally take back what's ours." The group nodded silently, their faces a mix of fear and determination. The time for words was over. They all knew the risks, but they also knew they couldn't let Margaret's cruelty continue. One by one, the rebels moved into position, creeping silently through the plantation. They had carefully studied the layout of the estate, knowing exactly where they needed to be and when. Samuel, Elijah, Marcus, and the others moved with purpose, their footsteps muffled by the thick grass beneath them. Their mission was clear. They would storm Margaret's quarters and put an end to her experiments once and for all. As they neared the mansion, Thomas signaled for everyone to halt. He knew they had to be careful. The mansion was still under the watchful eye of the overseers, and any noise or disruption could alert Margaret to their plan. They had no room for error. They waited in the shadows, watching as the lights flickered inside the mansion. Margaret, unaware of the rebellion unfolding outside her door, was likely preparing for another round of her sick experiments. Thomas's blood boiled at the thought. The woman who had treated them like animals, who had used their lives as pawns in her twisted game, would no longer have the power to harm anyone else. With a single nod from Thomas, the group moved forward again, creeping toward the back door of the mansion. The overseers, too drunk or too distracted by their own comforts, were easy to avoid. The slaves had spent years learning the art of moving unnoticed, of being invisible in the eyes of those who held power over them. They reached the back door, and Thomas motioned for Samuel and Elijah to take the lead. They had been chosen for this task because of their strength and speed. With quiet precision, they forced the door open, and the group slipped inside. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. The slaves moved quickly through the halls, their footsteps barely making a sound as they approached Margaret's quarters. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained focused. They had to be swift. They had to be certain. When they reached the door to Margaret's private laboratory, Thomas motioned for the others to stop. He took a deep breath, knowing this would be the most dangerous part of their mission. Margaret was a dangerous woman, capable of cruelty beyond anything they had yet seen. But she was also vulnerable, isolated in her obsession, blind to the fact that her control was slipping away. Thomas pushed the door open, and the group entered the room. Inside, Margaret sat at her desk, her back to them, poring over a stack of papers, likely more records of her grotesque experiments. Her obsession had made her careless. She had become so consumed with her work that she had forgotten to maintain the illusion of control. And now, that very obsession was about to be her undoing. For a moment, the room was silent. The only sound was the soft rustle of paper as Margaret flipped through her notes, unaware of the danger lurking behind her. "Margaret." Thomas's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. She froze, her hand hovering over the papers as she slowly turned to face him. Her eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in fury as she recognized the group standing before her. "You," she hissed, her voice sharp and full of venom. "What are you doing in here? You—" "Shut up." Samuel's voice was like ice, cutting her off. "This ends tonight." Margaret's eyes flickered with fear, but she quickly masked it with a sneer. "You think you can stop me? You think you can undo everything I've done? You're nothing." Elijah's voice was filled with quiet fury. "You're a monster, and tonight, your experiments end." For a brief moment, Margaret looked as though she might try to fight back, perhaps even call for help, but she knew it was pointless. The slaves had already taken control. Her power had vanished like smoke in the air. "You've ruined us," Thomas said, stepping forward. "You've broken us, tried to twist our bodies and minds to your will. But we're not your experiments. We're human." Margaret stood up suddenly, her face twisted with rage and desperation. "You don't understand," she spat. "I was improving you. I was making you better. You're nothing but animals. And you'll never be more than that." Thomas's anger flared, but he remained calm, his voice unwavering. "You were never improving us, Margaret. You were destroying us. And now, you're the one who's broken." With that, Thomas signaled to the others. They moved quickly, securing Margaret in the very chains she had used to bind their lives. She struggled, but it was futile. Her strength was no match for their unity. As Margaret was dragged out of her study, her face twisted with both rage and fear. The plantation seemed to exhale in relief. The darkness that had gripped it for so long was beginning to lift, and in its place, there was something new, something born of rebellion, of resistance, of reclaiming the humanity that had been stolen. The night air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of crickets, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted within the walls of the mansion. The rebellion had come, swift and violent, but its aftermath was anything but. The enslaved people of Westfield Plantation had taken control, but it was not the victory they had hoped for. There was no immediate celebration, no wild revelry. Instead, there was a somber recognition of the weight of what had just happened. Margaret Westfield, once the queen of her domain, was now nothing more than a prisoner, bound by the very chains she had used to hold others captive. Her cries echoed through the halls, her pride and arrogance shattered in the face of her defeat. The woman who had treated human lives as mere experiments now found herself the subject of her own twisted games, a puppet of her own making. She had seen her world fall apart in the blink of an eye, her control ripped away by those she had once believed beneath her. The slaves, no longer slaves in the truest sense of the word, now stood on the threshold of freedom. But freedom, Thomas knew, was never as simple as just stepping out of a cage. It wasn't the lack of physical change that would define their future. It was the trauma, the scars, both visible and invisible, that would linger long after the fires of revolt had died down. Thomas stood at the center of the rebel group, his eyes scanning the faces of those around him. They were still a mix of fear, exhaustion, and disbelief. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Eleanor had watched the events unfold from her chambers, unable to leave her room as the rebellion raged. She had been a prisoner for so long, trapped in her marriage and in her role as Margaret's subject, that she hadn't known what it truly felt like to be free. Yet, as she watched Thomas and the others move through the mansion, reclaiming their dignity and humanity, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. When the rebellion had started, Eleanor's first instinct had been to flee, to run as far from the chaos as possible. But as the dust began to settle, she realized that there was nowhere to run. She couldn't leave the others behind, and she couldn't allow Margaret's reign of terror to continue. She, too, had been complicit in the silence, in the pretending that everything was fine. But not anymore. With a quiet resolve, Eleanor left her chambers, stepping cautiously into the hallway. She had heard the sounds of the struggle, of the chaos, and she knew that now was the time for action. Margaret was no longer in control, but what would happen next? Where would they go? What would they do with their newfound freedom? She found Thomas standing near the staircase, deep in conversation with Samuel. The two men were speaking quietly, their faces etched with the weight of everything that had transpired. "Thomas," Eleanor called softly, stepping toward them. He turned, his eyes meeting hers with a look of quiet understanding. "Eleanor," he said, "you're safe." "I'm safe," she repeated, her voice trembling. "But now what? What happens to all of us? Where do we go from here?" Thomas paused, his expression serious. "We rebuild. We move forward. The Colonel's estate is ours now. But it won't be easy. We've just begun. The world outside is not going to change overnight. The rebellion. This was just the first step. We have to take back our lives, and we have to take them from the ground up." "But Margaret," Eleanor trailed off, unsure of what to say. "Margaret is done," Samuel said, his voice firm. "But her legacy? That's what we're fighting against now. The fear she instilled in everyone, the belief that we were less than human, that's the true battle. That's what we have to overcome." Eleanor nodded, understanding the truth of his words. It wasn't just about defeating Margaret. It wasn't even about the physical freedom they had just gained. It was about fighting against the years of mental and emotional chains that had bound them, about reclaiming what had been stolen from them long before Margaret had ever arrived. The next few days were spent in quiet reflection and uneasy planning. The plantation, though now under the control of the rebels, was still a place of deep, lingering trauma. The slaves who had once worked in the fields were now free, but many were still struggling to understand what that freedom truly meant. Their lives had been controlled for so long that they didn't know where to begin. And while the rebellion had brought a momentary victory, the road ahead was unclear. The mansion was gutted, its once pristine rooms now a reminder of everything they had fought to escape. Thomas knew that they couldn't stay on the plantation forever. The outside world would eventually come looking for them, slave catchers, bounty hunters, and perhaps even those who had once called the plantation home. Margaret had many allies, and they would stop at nothing to regain control of what they had lost. But there was something else at play. The people who had once been subjugated, who had once been forced to toil in the fields and endure endless cruelty, were now standing together, united by their shared trauma, their shared pain, and their shared desire for a future free of fear. They were no longer slaves. They were survivors, and that was something that no one could take away from them. As Thomas walked through the grounds of the plantation, he could see the changes taking place. The once empty fields were now filled with activity, the men and women working together to gather what little they had left. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. The fire that had sparked the rebellion was still alive in their hearts. Eleanor joined him, standing silently by his side. They didn't need to speak. They both knew what needed to be done. They would rebuild, but it would take time. They would make the plantation their own, turning it from a place of horror into one of refuge and freedom. They would show the world that no one could break them, no matter how much they tried. "You've done it, Thomas," Eleanor said softly. "You've given us something we didn't think was possible." "We've all done it," Thomas replied. "And we're not done yet. We still have a long way to go. But this is the beginning." The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the plantation, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air felt lighter. It wasn't just the end of a nightmare, it was the start of something new, something powerful, something they had taken back. The days following the rebellion at Westfield Plantation were filled with uncertainty. The dust from the revolt had settled, but the plantation's transformation was only just beginning. The once lavish mansion, a symbol of Margaret Westfield's control and cruelty, now stood as a hollow monument to the suffering it had witnessed. For the rebels, for those who had fought and bled to reclaim their dignity, it was no longer a place of oppression. It was their home, their refuge. But the road ahead was long, and the challenges were far from over. The group of rebels had taken control of the estate, but they knew that this victory was not final. The plantation, once a fortress of power, was now a symbol of defiance. But defiance alone wouldn't keep them safe. The world outside would not forget the Westfield estate so easily. Margaret's allies, those who had turned a blind eye to her cruelty, those who had benefited from her twisted experiments, would not let the fall of the estate go unanswered. They would come. They would seek to reclaim what had been lost. As the sun began to rise over the plantation the morning after Margaret's capture, Thomas stood at the edge of the fields, his eyes scanning the horizon. The familiar hum of the land, the sound of birds, of rustling leaves in the wind now felt like a distant echo. The freedom they had fought for, that they had won with their blood, was fragile. He knew that their enemies were not far behind. And while the rebels had been victorious, they now had to navigate a world that still viewed them as property, still saw them as something to be exploited. The group of former slaves, now free people, had gathered in the main hall of the mansion, their voices quiet but filled with determination. They had formed a council of sorts, led by Thomas, with a sense of unity that hadn't existed before. The mansion, which had once been the colonel's domain, now belonged to them. But it was no longer just about survival. It was about rebuilding, about creating a new life for themselves, a life free from the chains that had bound them for so long. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the hall, her hands clasped in front of her. She had been with them through every step of the rebellion, but now she had a different role. No longer the colonel's wife, no longer a prisoner in her own home. She was free. And with that freedom, she had found a purpose. She stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with an undeniable strength. "We've won our freedom," she said, her eyes sweeping over the room. "But it's not enough to simply be free. We have to protect it. We have to ensure that what we've built here is ours, that we're never again at the mercy of people like Margaret. People who see us as nothing more than experiments." The others nodded, their faces filled with determination. Margaret's twisted legacy had left a scar on each of them, but it had also given them something else. A fire that would burn through the darkness of the past and light the way for the future. "We'll need to defend what we've taken," Samuel said, stepping forward. His face, though worn with exhaustion, held a quiet resolve. "The world won't just let us go. They'll come after us, those who want to see us return to where we were. We have to be ready." Thomas nodded in agreement. "We will fight, but we won't fight just for ourselves. We fight for everyone who's ever been broken by people like Margaret, for everyone who's ever been made to feel less than human. We fight to make sure no one else ever has to suffer what we've suffered." The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of Thomas's words settled over them. This was no longer about survival. This was about something bigger. This was about creating a future where they could live with dignity, where they could control their own destinies. As the days turned into weeks, the plantation slowly began to take on a new life. The fields that had once been worked by the enslaved now grew under the careful hands of the freed people. The mansion, though worn and scarred by years of violence, was being restored, each room filled with a new sense of purpose, a new sense of belonging. The people who had once been silenced now spoke freely, their voices carrying through the halls with pride and defiance. But it wasn't easy. The scars of the past were still fresh, and the threat of Margaret's allies loomed large. Thomas knew that they couldn't rest. The rebellion had been a victory, yes, but it was only the beginning. They still had to protect what they had fought for. One evening, as Thomas sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he heard footsteps approaching. Eleanor joined him, her expression thoughtful as she looked out over the land. "You've done something extraordinary, Thomas," she said quietly. "But I know you're not finished. The fight isn't over." Thomas glanced at her, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "No, it's not. But we're ready for whatever comes next. We've built something here, and no one is going to take it from us." Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "You've given us something that we never thought possible. You've shown us what it means to truly be free, to be in control of our own lives." "We all did it together," Thomas said softly. "We're free, Eleanor, and we're going to stay free." As they sat together in the fading light, the plantation seemed to hum with life. It was no longer a place of fear or oppression. It was a place of hope, of renewal, of resilience. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer the defining feature of the land. The people who had once been enslaved, who had once been torn apart by cruelty and despair, were now building something new. The night was calm, and the stars shone brightly overhead. A reminder that no matter how dark the past had been, there was always the possibility of a new dawn. And in that moment, Thomas knew one thing for certain. They had not just survived, they had risen, and they would never go back.